An inferno has engulfed a major Russian drone depot in the latest Ukrainian long-range strike, amid claims that North Korea is now supplying almost half the artillery ammunition that Putin's forces are using to blast Ukraine. Kharkiv again. This is a scene again. We're in Kharkiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. We're starting with those overnight strikes, long-range Ukrainian strikes on targets inside Russia. One of them has hit what appears to be a drone depot in Oktyabrskyi near Yeysk. That is some 300 miles inside Russian territory, and a second airfield in Khanskyi has also been hit. These are two targets about 300 miles apart from each other, both of them hundreds of miles inside Russian territory, a continuation of this long-running Ukrainian campaign to hit high-value Russian military targets inside Russian soil. And we've seen this now sort of forking into a two-pronged approach. We've seen the sustained attacks against airfields, trying to degrade the places that Russia uses to launch the aircraft that launch the glide bombs and the strikes, the cruise missile strikes against targets across Ukraine. We've also seen more recently, and most notably with those dramatic attacks in Toropets, in Tver, a focus on hitting ammunition depots, and that's because Ukraine now appears to be determined to try and degrade Russia's ability to sustain its forces, because Russia is pounding Ukraine relentlessly. And there is a statistic that we've heard from Western officials just this last week that Russia is firing 6 million artillery shells a year at Ukraine, and 3 million of those, around half of those shells, are now coming from North Korea. And that tells us a couple of things. It reminds us just of the scale, the violence of this conflict, this state-on-state conflict. 6 million shells, that's about one every 5 seconds, half of them coming from North Korea. That tells us that Russia is at the moment unable to sustain, either from its own stockpiles or its own manufacturing capability, this spectacularly high rate of fire. And we know that Vladimir Putin has been forced to forge these ever closer ties with Pyongyang in order to get his hands on North Korean munitions and missiles. So North Korea is now supplying dumb artillery munitions. That is the main weapon of this conflict, but they're also supplying longer range missiles as well, and we've seen the shrapnel of those up close and personal on our visits to the aftermaths of some of these strikes inside Ukraine. We've also heard just in the last week that confirmation that North Korean military soldiers have deployed to what is occupied Ukraine, to Donetsk. And there are claims that has been confirmed by South Korea's defense minister, South Korea having some of the best intelligence penetration of their neighbor, their rival, and their enemy, North Korea. We've also heard reports from Ukrainian intelligence that at least 6 of those North Korean soldiers were killed in a Ukrainian missile strike against a military target near Donetsk city about a week ago. Some 20 Russian soldiers also reportedly killed in that strike. So just proof of North Korea's ever closer ties to Russia, their commitment both in terms of resources and now also in terms of men, soldiers sent to support Russia's war effort. 6 of them have been killed. Pyongyang had said that it was going to send engineering troops to try and, I think they said at the time, to rebuild, to repair damage to Donetsk. We understand from these latest reports that actually these soldiers are involved in either upgrading or repairing military equipment rather than any sort of civilian infrastructure or bridges or buildings. Across the rest of the front line inside Ukraine, Russian forces have been launching a relentless tempo of assaults, and particularly mechanized assaults. The Institute for the Study of War has recorded at least 4 battalion-sized mechanized assaults since the end of July. They've reported a high tempo of operations just recently in Kharkiv in the northeast, in Kupiansk, further to the east and in Pokrovsk, in the sort of southeastern part of that front line. We've talked about Pokrovsk because Russian forces have advanced to within just a few miles of that city, which straddles a major road and rail junction. And of course, last week we talked about Volkhadar, that symbolic town nearby that was captured by Russian forces, Ukrainian troops forced to retreat. Now, one reason for this tempo of operations, there's two reasons. One is possibly driven by the weather. As we move into the autumn, Ukraine will be expecting more rainfall. That rain will turn the ground soft. It turns fields into sort of boggy quagmires. That makes it much harder for vehicles like tanks and heavy armoured vehicles to move across the ground, particularly if they want the freedom to move away from the road. So there is a time constraint driven by the weather that may be leading to an increase in tempo. But having said that, last year, last autumn, last winter, we didn't see much of a lull. And at the same time, what we are seeing this year and we saw then is a deliberate attempt by Russia to not let up, to not give Ukraine's forces any real opportunity to catch their breath and regroup. So Russia continuing to fight very, very hard across the front lines. They have been making gains, and we've talked about those gains. We talked about them specifically last week around Volkhadar. They've also been attacking the Ukrainian forces in Kursk, inside sovereign Russia, in that pocket of territory that Ukraine managed to capture in August. And Ukraine has had to cede some of that ground, although they are still very much there. And indeed, to the surprise of Western officials, Ukrainian forces have managed to cling on to that territory, which one would have imagined Russia would have been so determined to take back almost at any cost. These Russian assaults are taking a huge toll on Russia's resources. We've heard these figures before, previous estimates that Russia was losing up to around 1,000 soldiers a day. The latest estimate from Western officials suggests that that's actually increased in some instances to 1,200 soldiers dead and wounded a day. And the Institute for the Study of War has also cited open source intelligence reports based on photographs from the front line suggesting that Russia, in just Pokrovsk area alone, over the course of the last year, has lost around 500 tanks, over 1,000 armoured vehicles, and 22 multiple launch rocket systems, like Grad systems or possibly more sophisticated systems, but nonetheless rocket launchers. Now that is, by some estimates, 5 divisions worth of heavy armour and significant pieces of military equipment. And that leads us back to almost where we started, talking about those artillery shells. There is an element of this conflict which is just about which side can sustain the fight the longest. It's that attritional conflict. Ukraine fighting its much bigger, better resourced neighbour, but of course Ukraine fighting with support from its Western partners. In terms of that support from Western partners, worth mentioning a report on CNN suggesting that NATO's Supreme Allied Commander, General Christopher Cavoli, had briefed US congressmen and women on the types of support, military support, that America has in its gift, but which it has not yet given Ukraine. Weapons that could make a difference on the battlefield that America has not yet, or may never, but has not handed over. And these included a missile called the Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Attack Missile, or JASSM. Now this is an air-launched cruise missile, a bit like a bigger, better, more powerful Storm Shadow with a published range of around 900 kilometers. We're not sure the reason for this briefing or the timing of it. The fact it's come out, and this could be a veiled warning to Russia of the capabilities that remain in the arsenal of Ukraine's Western allies, that remain in its gift to hand over. But of course, at the moment, America has been the handbrake in terms of what weapons Ukraine can use where. Whilst America remains by far the biggest unilateral donor of both money and military aid, it's also America that has refused to let Ukraine use British-supplied Storm Shadows and French-supplied Scalp air-launched cruise missiles against targets inside Russia. And that is because of the White House's concern over spiralling this conflict into a bigger, larger World War III-style direct confrontation between Russia and NATO countries. Final thing to mention today is that President Zelensky is here in London. He's met Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer, Britain's Foreign Secretary, Defence Secretary, and the head of the UK Armed Forces, Admiral Tony Radakin. We understand outlining his plan for victory. He's also met the new NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte. They haven't, as far as we know, come to any new agreements over the use of those Storm Shadow weapons. That is a Ukrainian priority. They want permission to use them against Russian targets. They are, nonetheless, Zelensky suggested outlining his plan for victory. And he said that plan was about trying to ensure that there could be a peace, and a just peace could be brokered with Russia. Everything at the moment seems to hang on the outcome of the upcoming American presidential election. There's also been reports out this week that former President Donald Trump may have held at least 7 phone calls with Russian President Vladimir Putin since Trump left office. Now, the relationship between Trump and Putin is of huge concern to the Ukrainians because Trump has called President Putin a genius, called him his friend, and suggested he could end the war in Ukraine in a day. And there are fears that that claim is really about forcing Ukraine to capitulate. So everything that's happening now happens in the shadow of that looming election. If you're watching on YouTube and you have any questions, please do ask them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next week. Thank you for all the questions last time round. A lot of you seem quite upset about the use of the word symbolic to describe Volkhedar rather than strategic. And some of you questioning whether or not this was a retreat or a rout. We'll start with symbolic or strategic. The word strategic is bandied around a lot in terms of towns, particularly when towns or positions change hands on the front line. Strategic is generally used to define a position or an evolution in the conflict that will have far-reaching consequences across the rest of the theatre, or perhaps a strategic change would change the ambitions or the goals of one side or another. Volkhedar is not that. It was a small settlement that sat 2 miles from a much bigger town of Pavlivka, which had been in Russian hands for the best part of 2 years. And it was Pavlivka that straddled the major roads. Volkhedar was really the point at which Ukraine had managed to stop Russian forces advancing beyond. It is, however, symbolic because Ukraine had invested so much effort and so many lives in defending it over these last 2 years. And that symbolism is important because, in many ways, a lot of this conflict is being fought. The symbolism affects morale. It was symbolic that Ukraine captured sovereign Russian territory in Kursk, not necessarily strategic, although perhaps more strategic, because holding sovereign Russian soil for the first time might allow Ukraine to change the dynamic of any future peace negotiations. Was it a rout? Was it a retreat? Ukrainian forces, there's no doubt, were forced to retreat by the sheer weight and force of Russia's advances. It was a Russian victory. It was a Ukrainian loss. I'm not trying to put an unnecessary gloss on that. Question number 2, where are the F-16s? It's a good question. We haven't really seen them since August, since President Zelensky confirmed they were first used in combat. And of course, one of them was lost in what may have been a friendly fire incident. One of you pointing out Ukraine appears to be paying a very heavy price for giving up its nuclear weapons. This is a reference to the 1994 Budapest Accords. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, Ukraine had a number of Soviet nuclear weapons on its soil, which it agreed to return to Russia in exchange for the agreement of the United Kingdom, the United States and the USSR to respect its sovereignty. There is an argument that had Ukraine not done that, it would not be in the situation it is in now. Clearly, Russia has not respected Ukraine's sovereignty. The United States and the United Kingdom did not do enough prior to 2014 and indeed prior to the full-scale invasion in 2022 to force Russia to abide by its commitments underneath those 1994 Budapest memoranda. Another question about all the weapons that are being given to Ukraine. One of you points out we call the F-16s game changers, the Leopard 2 tanks game changers, the Challengers game changers, all these game-changing weapons. Maybe I've left some of them out. But how have they changed the game? Well, it's a fair question. Some weapons I think we were very excited about. Others I think we were more cautious about. Indeed, we repeatedly warned that the F-16s were unlikely to be game changers because of the nature of how they would be used. We always said, more likely to be used for air defence, which is what we've seen. Some weapons have really changed the dynamic of the conflict. The GMLRS long-range multiple-launch rocket systems, which the United Kingdom and the United States donated in the first autumn of the war, are what led to the Russian collapse around Kharkiv, their chaotic retreat eastwards then, and the Russian decision to abandon their positions in Kherson, the only regional capital they'd captured during the course of the war, and their only positions on the right bank of the Dnieper River. But since then, the advent of the Leopard and the Challenger 2 tanks, the advent of the F-16s have not significantly revolutionised the dynamic, the power dynamic, the balance of power on the battlefield. And that isn't necessarily a surprise. You'll remember Ukraine's former commander, General Alexander Syrsky, in an essay he wrote that was published in The Economist, said almost a year ago that he did not expect any one new technology, any one magic bullet weapon to precipitate a sudden collapse of the other side. We're not in that stage of the conflict. Of course, both sides would desperately like it, but it doesn't appear to exist. The Ukrainian belief at the moment is if there is going to be a collapse or a spectacular breakthrough, it's not going to be made in the positional conflict in the trenches and the towns and the fields of eastern Ukraine where this war is being fought. It's far more likely to happen in those long-range strikes, degrading Russia's resources and trying to hit, as we've seen before, Russia's economy with the strikes against oil refineries and storage sites. Finally, last question from a viewer in Lesotho. Why do the people of Ukraine not just surrender and save lives? Well, I think that's a question really we'd have to ask the Ukrainians, but it's the Ukrainians who have decided to stand and fight. And it's perhaps because they know that if they don't stand and fight, their country, their identity will cease to exist. Ukraine is fighting for its survival against a Russia which makes no secret of stating that Ukraine has no right to exist as a sovereign country. So they are fighting for their very existence. If you've got any questions, as I said before, please do ask them in the comments below. I'll try and answer as many as I can next week. And if I can't, I'll also get into the comments as well and try and answer some of them there as well.